Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the DoubleEdged YouTube channel. And this is in the Scientific Editor series. And I'm very happy to have lead editor and scientific editor Steve Kawaler with us today. Hey, Steve.
How you doing, Frank?
I am doing quite well today. You have got an amazing collection of stuff behind you there.
Yeah, it's a clever virtual background, isn't it?
It's a real virtual background.
Yeah, the view of the Iowa mountains is kind of ugly. So.
Ah, you're on the Great Plains of Iowa. Yes, well renowned for their very big mountains.
Especially into the wind.
Which is always blowing. I think I did a bike ride a couple times in Iowa.
Across Iowa, maybe.
I've never done RAGBRAI. I've never done across Iowa. I'm quite aware, but you've probably done the ride across Iowa a couple times.
About 13 or 14 times, yeah.
That is awesome.
It is great. It is great. Handling manuscripts all the way.
And he's not kidding, people. I've seen him where he's got his phone out and he's doing stuff on the road. So we should give you the title of mobile scientific editor. How about that?
The last full week in July, yes, that's true.
That's so cool. So Steve, what do you like to do for research?
I like to find time to research. It's not always possible, but when I can find time, I'm what you might call an astroseismologist, which is it's now a very large field. It wasn't always a very large field, but it's a large field of stellar astrophysics. We use the oscillations of stars, vibrations of stars, to probe what's going on their insides. It's a combination of observational expertise with a little bit of theory thrown in order to interpret those observations and get out information about what's going on inside of stars.
Right. Very cool. So I'm always curious how, because there's so many things one can do in astronomy. And I'm always curious how people get into the fields that they do. Sometimes it's by choice. Sometimes they just sort of fall into it. So I'm curious, how did you get into the field of stellar seismology?
How much time do we have?
As much as you want.
Well, I started out as a kid loving astronomy ever since before I can remember. Somewhere on that bookshelf is my first astronomy book, the Golden Book of Astronomy. Cool. And I always wanted to be an observer. I always wanted to use telescopes and look at stuff. That's after I realized I couldn't be an astronaut because I have a fear of heights. But when I went to college, I ended up working in a little bit of radio astronomy, planetary radio astronomy. That looked exciting. Cool. Then I ended up in graduate school, and I took an amazing, amazing course in stellar interiors from a guy named Craig Wheeler. Remains one of my mentors today. It was just a brilliant course. He's a very charismatic lecturer, and the subject matter was just really super amazing. I did not realize that you could know that much about stars without ever seeing below the photosphere. And that to me was just a revelation. So I started to work on modeling and modeling of stars. At about the same time, Don Winget was a postdoc at the University of Texas when I was a grad student there, and he was looking for grad students to grab up. Craig mentioned that I had an interest in stellar interiors, and Don was looking for somebody to work on white dwarf stars, pulsating white dwarf stars. Yeah. And so, as we say in Yiddish, the shittach was made, the match was made. And I started working with Don, who was one of the pioneers in white dwarf oscillations. And so he got me excited about it. Don can get you excited about a candle going out, but he got me very excited about pulsating white dwarf stars, and we ended up, I ended up writing a thesis based on work that we had done together on stellar oscillations in white dwarfs, non-radial oscillations. So it was just a combination of meeting the perfect mentors at the perfect time in their career and my own that sort of pushed me into this area. And now we can indeed learn about stars from below the photosphere. It's something that seemed impossible in the 1970s.
Yeah, it's been quite an evolution. So speaking of, how about a little future look? What do you think? What do you think's on the horizon? Let's say over the next 5 years or so for stellar seismology. We got new missions coming on. Is there new theoretical calculations coming up? What do you see on the horizon?
Well, if you had asked me this question 12 years ago, just prior to the launch of the Kepler spacecraft, I would have said, Well, gee, I don't know. Kepler might do something useful for stellar seismology.
Maybe.
As it's turned out, if you read the pages of the Astrophysical Journal, Kepler has completely revolutionized the field of astroseismology. Before the launch of Kepler, a planet-finding spacecraft, we had really great data on a handful of stars, white dwarfs, a few main sequence stars, a bunch of other stars like, well, Delta Scuti stars and Cepheids and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we were doing a little bit of seismology then. Kepler completely changed the field entirely by giving us data, photometric data on stars that allowed us to do astroseismology on hundreds and thousands of stars on the main sequence, on the giant branch, and so on. So this question 12 years ago, I would have guessed that Kepler would have been important. In retrospect, Kepler has completely changed the field.
And of course, that was not its primary mission, right?
Well, Frank, it depends on how you look at it. If you look at the number of papers published with Kepler data on exoplanets, it's almost the same as the number of Kepler papers published on stellar astrophysics. Mm-hmm. So yes, Kepler was a $600 million gift to the stellar seismology community that also found some planets. Mm-hmm. Now, the game has changed. It's a huge field now. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of astronomers that show up for astroseismology meetings. When in the turn of the last century, there are maybe dozens. What's in the future are future missions like Plato, or Plato as some of my colleagues call it, mm-hmm. which is going to take what Kepler and TESS are doing in searching for exoplanets and doing stellar astrophysics to the next level, being able to look at a larger number of stars over the entire sky. And so the revolution was Kepler, presaged a little bit by Corot. That's now an evolutionary process from Kepler to TESS and TESS to Plato. That's on the observational side. There's also a lot you can do from the ground still in astroseismology. All of what the space has given us is photometry, looking at the brightness variations as a function of time. From the ground, with networks of very precise spectrographs, you can do radial velocity astroseismology. And so there are a number of networks either operating or in development to do that for fainter and fainter stars. And from radial velocity observations, you get a not quite orthogonal sets of information, but useful information that enhances what you can get photometrically. On the theory side, well, you're a MESA maven, you tell me. Modeling so far has been really good on converting the observed oscillations into stellar properties at a wholesale level. There are some mysteries that remain, stars that don't show oscillations that should, and we're still kind of scratching our heads over those. And so these sort of mysteries that appear when you do wholesale astroseismic observations are going to be pushing theorists for decades to come, I think.
Yeah, and sometimes you occasionally get, a non-card carrying stellar seismologist to make an incursion into the field. So it's a strange attractor.
Well, it's gone from sort of cutting edge astrophysics to a tool that lots of people can use, and that's where you want to be. You want to be at a point where you've developed a tool and people can come in, learn a little bit about the tool, but use the tool in new and interesting ways that you never thought of as a card-carrying astroseismologist. Many years ago, back when I was a grad student, as I was preparing my first APJ paper, in fact, an astronomer named Iko Eben visited. Now, Iko is one of the, yeah, you heard the name. One of the founders of computational astrophysics, in particular stellar structure, and he came to learn a little bit about what we were doing with white dwarf modeling. And one of the things he told me was, any fool can make a white dwarf. They turn out to be fairly easy stars to model, at least the basics. But then when you look at the subtleties, the observational challenges are immense, even for those simple models. And so I took that quote, any fool can make a white dwarf, to keep me humble and realize that, yeah, you can use a tool to make a model, but it's what you do with that tool and what you do with that model that really pushes science forward.
Indeed. So you mentioned it. So and I'll put a link. I'll put a link in the description below the video. So what was your very first Double-Edged Journals article? APJ, AJ, whatever.
Well, if we don't count published abstracts from AAS meetings, in
refereed. Referee.
Refereed. Okay, there you go. Let's see. My first paper was probably what turned into one of the early chapters in my thesis. It was on evolutionary period changes in pulsating hot white dwarf stars.
Okay.
My thesis was focused on then new observations of a hot white dwarf at 120,000 Kelvin called PG 1159-035.
Mm-hmm.
If I could get that many letters on a custom Iowa license plate, that would be
You
my
would do it.
And you now know the password to most of my e-shopping things. Anyhow, PG, I should change that. PG 1159 was a hot white dwarf discovered by John McGraw. It was realized soon after it was discovered to be a pulsator that it should be evolving for stars really quickly. Now, most stars cool on timescales of hundreds of millions or billions of years.
Mm-hmm.
PG 1159 was in the hot phase of the white dwarf, cooling very rapidly on timescale of 1 million years or so.
Nice.
And because of that cooling, Don Winget, Carl Hansen, and Hugh Van Horn realized that structural changes should be rapid enough that if it was a stable pulsator, you should see changes in the pulsation period, which we can measure with astonishing precision very rapidly. We should be able to measure the period changes over the course of a year or two. That is, actually measure the pace of stellar evolution.
Mm-hmm.
They published that in, I think, Science or Nature in 1983, just about the time I was starting my thesis. And my thesis was to provide some theoretical sort of flesh to those bones, to make models of hot white dwarf stars, calculate their oscillation frequencies as a function of the model's evolutionary phase, and predict what the pulsation period changes should be. The thing that made it very exciting, beyond just measuring stellar evolution for one of the first times ever, was that the thing that dominates the cooling of those stars isn't cooling by emission of ordinary radiation photons. It was cooling by neutrino emission.
Yes.
At those very, very dense conditions at the center, you produce neutrinos through basically thermal processes. Once produced, the neutrino zips out of the star, it doesn't interact anymore, and takes away energy, doesn't thermalize with the surroundings, doesn't heat up the outside. And so these stars cool in a dominant neutrino cooling process. So if we could measure the cooling rate, we could actually measure the neutrino production rate, something that had been never measured experimentally before. It was a purely theoretical calculation. So this paper, circling back, was the first set of models of cooling white dwarfs that had a realistic treatment of the thermal profile on the inside, realistic treatment of neutrino emission, to calculate not only the periods to try and match the observations, but also the period change rates.
Yep, P-dot.
So the paper's probably faster read than my description just now. I'm surprised I remembered all the details right here. But it was a very exciting moment for me. I had published 1 or 2 papers in the bulletin, one peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, but this was my first real paper with the Astrophysical Journal. And I was responsible for writing it. I wrote the first draft. It was completely torn apart by my co-authors, Carl Hansen and Don Winget, because I had no clue as to how to write a real paper at that time in my career. And so we iterated back and forth. Somewhere in my office, which I'm occasionally allowed to visit, I have the drafts, hand typewritten drafts,
yes.
red lines from my thesis advisors and so on. The original graphics which were back then done with a pen plotter, a Zeta plotter.
Right.
And then the journal required camera-ready images, which meant I had to give it to our graphic arts department. And we had a graphic artist on staff who would then make a beautiful illustration based on the plot. We had to make sure he did it accurately, didn't make it pretty. Right. And that's what we sent in as a slick graphic along with the manuscript in a brown envelope to the journal offices. I believe they were at Kit Peak at the time. And the editor was Helmut Abt. So I had a cover letter, Dear Helmut, or Dear Dr. Abt, sorry. I was just a kid at the time. And we would mail that off and just some time later, the referee report came back by mail.
By mail.
Yeah, many of the people watching this are probably unaware that you were unable to submit things electronically until fairly recently for old folks like me.
And there weren't things like ADS where one could do some pretty deep and quick literature searches. You had to go dig into the actual printed pages, and there was this big fat index book, and you could trace a line through the literature.
The Astronomy and Astrophysics Abstracts would come out yearly. It would be this big fat volume, but then there would be supplements, yellow, I think, bound volumes that we would go to the library and look through to find papers that we should be citing and to see what other people had done. Yeah, it feels like it was so long ago and so different than what we do today, but it's within one career lifetime. Yeah, it was an amazing change, gradual evolutionary change to what we have now. And we had some brilliant astronomers back then that are no longer with us. I can only imagine the kind of progress they would have been able to make if they had the tools that we have available today.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that authors sent in by mail, postal mail, to Helmut on where's my referee report.
Phone calls were big. Remember the telephone where you would sort of dial and actually speak through a handset? I think he probably dealt with a lot of those calls.
The phones, yeah. Now we just get emails at 3 weeks plus 1 hour.
Which is fine. I honestly, Frank, I don't mind when authors are a little impatient for a referee report back, because we do handle a lot of papers, and sometimes a deadline passes and we kind of miss it, and we're not doing as good a job as we can to chase referees. So when authors contact me, I'm usually thankful.
Yeah, I like authors. I think they're great.
Referees, even better.
They take a little more oomph to get going.
Sometimes,
hidden secrets here, people, of the editorial process. So let me ask about that then. So you from your first paper, you've had a distinguished and relatively long career publishing in the double-edged journals. And when did you become a science editor, and why did you decide to become a science editor?
I'd like to say I was headhunted for the job. Not quite true. Jim Liebert, who was a longtime associate editor with the journals, eventually decided to bow out. And Ethan was the relatively new editor-in-chief at the time. This is around 2006 or so. Was looking for someone to pick up where Jim was leaving off. Jim, a world expert in all small stars and lots of other things, brown dwarfs and white dwarfs in particular. I knew Jim well from our research. So apparently Ethan thought that I might be able to carry the kind of water that Jim had been carrying, which to me, to this day, I don't think I could ever have. But he called me. Ethan called me and said that there was an opening amongst the editorial staff, the APJ. Would I be interested in handling stellar type papers or whatever they ended up throwing at me? And I was really kind of clueless as to what editors do. I mean, I know I sent the paper to the APJ and I got a note back from the scientific editor saying it was going to be refereed. I didn't know really what the job was all about. So Ethan took the time to explain to me what was going on. And I've had very good experiences in my publishing career, both as an author and a referee, and I've had some horrible experiences. And of course, I was concerned about the horrible parts. And so I asked Ethan, how often do those happen? And he said, surprisingly rarely, which is a statement that's been backed up based on my experience. So after a little bit of back and forth, he did warn me that editors need to have thick skins, because of sometimes there's some fairly strong opinions held that are opposing one another between referees and authors. And I thought that I could live through that, so I agreed to give it a shot, and it went pretty well. I do want to say that Jim Liebert was really helpful in getting me started. He came to visit here in Ames, Iowa, gave a seminar, so we got a seminar out of him. I got to take him to a Kansas Iowa State basketball games. That was important to him. And then we spent a few days going through some papers that he was working on, showing me how it works. So
very cool. Very cool.
I really appreciated that sort of hand holding at the beginning.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's very good. Yeah. So I'm also one of Ethan. So I must have come on shortly after you did. It was sometime around 2008-ish, where I responded to an ad. There was actually an ad in the AAS job bulletin that the journals were looking for an editor. And I figured, it's probably about time maybe I try this. So it was the shortest job application I ever sent in. It was a single letter, single sentence to Ethan. And here we are.
So he didn't have to do the hard sell like he did with me then.
He didn't have to do the hard sell. You know, I did. He was in Canada at the time, so I did go up to up there and got some training from Janice, and away we went. My thick skin grew over time, but yeah, you need a little bit of resilience, I will say. So now you've been a scientific editor then for a little more than a decade, let's say, and now you're a lead editor. So what does a lead editor do?
Well, the new quote unquote new structure of lead editors and then scientific editors, it seems like it's an extra layer of bureaucracy between the author and the editor in chief, but in fact it does help things go a little bit more smoothly. Before we had lead editors, we just had a bevy of science editors that worked under Ethan. Ethan would assign papers to one of the science editors, usually based on the science editor's expertise, not always. He's helped, of course, by Butler Burton, who's the associate editor. But as astronomy grew, and as the APJ grew, and as the astronomical journal and astrophysical journal sort of, the separation between them became less and less clear. The AAS realized, I think, that it was a little too broad of job description, if you will, for a scientific editor. That is, we needed to organize them a little bit better, to make sure that we had all of the subjects fairly covered, but also to make sure that papers went through the right people. So that I was, as a science editor, if the other science editors that were working in areas that I had no clue about were totally swamped, I'd be brought in to oversee a paper that I had very little expertise in. That doesn't happen so much anymore because of the way the work can be divided by having a lead editor who is responsible for science editors in a somewhat narrower subcategory. Yeah. It also allowed us to increase the number of science editors, right? Because this way it wasn't up to Ethan to manage this huge team. The lead editors could be sort of a panel. He could impanel them to help organize the science editors. And so the way it was broken up, as most viewers know, if they've ever submitted a paper to the APJ, it was we broke up astronomy into a series of corridors. Think about an institute of astronomy where each physical corridor corresponds to a group working in related fields like galactic astrophysics or extragalactic astronomy or cosmology or planetary science. And along those corridors is where the expertise is concentrated. The corridors talk to one another, as people in an institute would gather at coffee at the center pre-COVID and talk about things of mutual interest. Then they'd go back. I'm drinking water these days. Then they'd go back and see how their work could apply to that sort of thing. The same thing happens amongst the lead editors and science editors. A paper will come in. If it's clearly a stellar interiors and stellar physics paper, it goes into my corridor. And I'll look at the subject and pick one of the science editors, one of my fellow science editors, who's best suited to that subject matter to handle that paper. As a science editor, I carry the same sort of load as all my others. Occasionally, a paper will come in that spans multiple corridors, and then Ethan will have to adjudicate which lead editor gets to oversee that. But in this way, a lead editor is able to best balance the workload of the science editors in that area, and also talk to the other lead editors in cases where a paper covers a lot of ground or a lot of space.
And you are the lead editor of the Stellar Physics Corridor?
That's correct.
Awesome.
That's correct, which covers Everything from the center of the star, occasionally to the circumstellar material, at any time of its birth, life, and approaching death. When they die, I hand it off to you.
Thank you.
Frank is the lead editor
I
for
do
things
get
that
one
blow
or
up.
two, one or two from Steve, where this is a little more on the post-death phase. And so, yeah, so I'm the lead editor for the high energy phenomena and fundamental physics corridor. So,
right. So if you're interested in exotic particles that might appear in the core of a white dwarf, Frank Carter might get it, or I might get it, depending on if it's white dwarfy or physicsy.
Yeah, I do get, like, there will be WIMPs or axions or other exotic particles of said form in white dwarfs, in the sun, for example. I've definitely taken some of those. Yeah, so it really kind of depends. But we do talk, and as Steve mentioned, there is shuffle depending on where the expertise lies.
Right.
And you mentioned those scientific editors, and you're one. I'm one. There's of order 30, if people are curious, of order 30 about these days. And so as a scientific editor, roughly how many new submissions do you deal with on a weekly basis?
Well, when I started with Ethan, the goal was that each science editor should handle up to 5 new submissions a week.
Mm-hmm.
And since this isn't our real job, that's a significant enough workload to keep us busy and in the game without overwhelming us. And I try and keep to that same load for all of the science editors in my corridor and me as well. It's probably similar to what the other corridors do. Now that's sort of an upper limit. Normally it's 3 or 4, sometimes 6, depending on whether or not people are writing papers quickly at the end of a semester or just before AAS meetings.
Or before summer break or whatever. There's definitely some peak period.
Right.
Yeah.
And I should point out that before I became an editor, I didn't read as much of the literature as I do now. Now part of my job is to manage papers. And so I'm reading papers in my research area, of course. If it's too close to my research area, I'll let some other editor handle it, of course. But I'm also reading papers that I probably would not have read otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really been an eye-opening experience throughout, handling papers in areas that I know very little about, but still think is very interesting. And then you also get this extra insight, right? Because you need to learn from the paper enough to choose an appropriate referee. Then you get a referee report back, which gives you sort of a perspective on this paper that you read, that you don't work in an area you don't work in, but you think is interesting, from another expert in the field. And so you learn very quickly where the cutting edge areas are in fields when you operate as the editor. It's been very, very scientifically stimulating for me.
Definitely. I handle, for example, a lot of cosmic ray papers, and I don't particularly publish in the cosmic ray. And so that was quite a learning experience, but it's been a really rich, rewarding experience to learn a new field. And although I still don't publish in cosmic rays, I know where the cutting edge is. I know who to go to for what types of those kind of fields. So. And the other thing I just want to mention is, although you may get 5 new ones in, there's a process, of course, the peer review process, and so in steady state, you've probably got of order 80-ish in various forms, and so you've got to keep sort of these all 80 in your head as it's going through the process.
And I should point out, maybe this is a little bit of inside baseball, but Frank is one of our more prolific editors, shall we say.
No comment on that.
I didn't think so. He does a remarkable job of handling papers that none of us could handle because they are so broad. And so Frank is a go-to editor for himself, but also many of us as well. So his workload is a little on the high side. And you wouldn't know it from looking at the turnaround times between receipt of manuscript and acceptance. All of our statistics are similar. So I'm very impressed with how Frank is able to manage that workload. But yeah, in a given week, I would say most of my time is spent reading referee reports And so we do send things out, but then referee reports come in. We need to digest those and give the author appropriate feedback and guidance. Then the second most time-consuming part of the week is when a revision comes back, looking through the new paper, making sure that the referee points have been addressed, or if they're not addressed, they've been argued properly, and then communicating with the referee. So a week's work is a balance of finding new referees for new papers, as well as dealing with feedback coming in from prior papers and feedback coming in from prior authors on referee reports that we sent them, sometimes months before, sometimes days before.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I think a larger fraction of time is spent looking for potential referees. When a new manuscript comes in, I will typically try and find 5, 6 potential referees before I ever send anything out. So that takes, for me, that takes a little bit of time to make sure I'm getting the right person with the right expertise, and then the process of, okay, can you do this? Will you do a review, please?
Right.
So yeah, but so of those manuscripts that come in, those, let's say 5 a week that come in, what do you think makes for a good, solid initial submission?
Lots of references to my work.
Hey, we'll clip this part out. No.
What? You're not editing? A good paper is one with no typos, good English, a clear, brief abstract, so that I, as an editor, can really get the essence of what the paper is quickly. And it's remarkable if you think about it. That's exactly what makes a good paper in general, right? If you write a clear, clean abstract and a concise introduction, you'll pull the reader in probably to read your paper instead of just looking at the figures and the conclusions, which a lot of us do when we're in a hurry, right? But those same sort of things makes a paper, a solid paper, a pleasure to handle as an editor, right? Because I can get quickly the gist of it and begin to think about other people in the field that might be good referees, and so on. So I think that a good lead, a good abstract, and a good introduction really helps, and that's not going to cause authors to get bent out of shape, because that's what people should be striving for in general. Mm-hmm. One thing that we do is we do check for plagiarism, which hasn't been a problem. Frankly, I haven't had a single case in all of these years of a paper that was plagiarized off of someone else's work. Mm-hmm. And so we do run that check, and we look at it, and it's never a problem. But another thing that authors, when they do it right, it makes it a pleasure to deal with, is figures. Mm. Figures and colors really can make it difficult for a reviewer, let's say, to see what's going on with small labels, overlapping symbols of similar colors and that sort of thing. Right. So when I get a paper and I look through the figures and make sure the figures are going to not be a problem for the referee as well as the reader. We do have excellent services from our data editors. Craig and Gus go through many submissions to make sure that the figures are appropriate, that the data behind the figures, if that's going to come up, or longer tables and so on, are manageable. They're wonderful at working with authors to make that happen. So that takes the pressure off of us when a paper does come in, because we know that that sort of behind the scenes work is going on. Yep. Another thing that I really appreciate, and I'm not sure how many other editors do, but I would bet most do, is suggestions for referees. Ah. When a paper comes in with suggestions for referees, that really helps, especially if it's an area that I'm not as familiar with as in my own research. Referees, or rather suggested referees, we will of course check to double check to make sure that they haven't just gotten a paper and we're not overloading them, that they haven't collaborated with the authors in a while, that there's no obvious institutional conflicts or anything. But that really gets us started in picking referees. Yeah. Also a list of deprecated referees.
Mhm.
This is something to be careful with. You don't want to abuse this, because if you're not careful and you list anybody that works in your field that you've ever had words with as a deprecated referee, we might not be able to find somebody.
Careful.
But that said, it's useful to know if there are certain people that you've had issues with in the past as an author.
Right.
And so we do need to see that. We're not bound to choose referees that you suggest or not choose referees that authors don't suggest, but we do try and follow those guidelines, and they really do streamline the reviewing process.
Indeed. So now the initial paper goes in and you've secured a referee and it goes out, and now you send the report back to the author. So let's take a look at it from the author point of view. So do you have any tips or guidance for authors during the peer review process?
Well, first of all, don't be so patient that if you haven't gotten a report in 5 weeks, you haven't bothered us yet. Please do. Often when we know a referee will be late, we'll communicate that to the author, but sometimes we don't get to that. And so if it's been too long, we do want to hear that you're tired of waiting. As an author myself, I know that I get tired of waiting, and as an editor, I know that the editor of the paper doesn't want to hear from me, but I still want to let them know that I'm waiting. But once the report comes in, the easiest thing for us is if in responding to that referee report, you respond point by point. Points you agree with, thank the author and thank the referee and say, we've done this. Points you disagree with, thank the referee and tell us why you disagree. That's what we're here for. We're here to adjudicate. Right. Some referees provide really valuable feedback. Some referees aren't, frankly, that great, and we try and catch that as editors, but we often miss it. Don't hold that against the referee or us, but explain to us what's the problem with those comments. We're all adults. Almost all of the interactions that I've seen between authors and referees have been perfectly civil and just fine. And that was a surprise to me, Frank. I don't know about you, but beforehand, you always remember the difficult referee report, right? And before I became an editor, I would get a report back and I would think, some child refereed this paper. They know nothing about G modes in white dwarfs. And then I'd calm down and try and you know, we have all had these reactions to difficult referee reports. But in the many years I've been doing this, I can count on one hand per year the number of really uncomfortable interactions between referee and author that I've had to deal with. It's really rare. When it happens to you, it doesn't feel like it's rare. But if you think back to all those who are watching that have published lots of paper, think back. They probably can't think of too many cases where that's happened. There are some fields that are worse than others, but by and large, the process goes really smoothly as long as the referee keeps to the science and the author's response keeps to the science. One pet peeve, and this is a little bit more inside baseball, since I assume that some people that are watching this are publishing astronomers. Please don't submit referee reports as PDFs. And please don't submit your response to the referee as a PDF if you can at all help it. That makes it really difficult for the responder, either responding to the report or responding to the author's response, to respond point by point.
Because then it's a paste from the PDF into text, plain ASCII text, and sometimes that doesn't go so well. It's just another step. It's just
right.
And oftentimes the PDF is not necessary. If you have equations, if you're putting in figures, okay, but those are generally a small fraction.
Right, and even in equations, almost all of us read LaTeX, so you can actually do the LaTeX as an ASCII. And ASCII, it's a beautiful art medium as well. If you remember ASCII art from the 70s. You can do a lot with a simple text file in terms of indenting and numbering and horizontal lines and stuff. So that makes it easier for everybody involved if you can avoid the PDF. As Frank said, if there is a complicated set of equations, fine. Figures, obviously. But generally speaking, again, as Frank said, I would say 90% of the PDFs we get add no new information to what text can provide. All right.
Pink replies.
And rand.
Don't you want to see the author's reply in pink? I mean, that adds so much information.
Yeah. Yeah, it does make it somewhat easier to see, but a space and then 3 greater than signs does the same.
Yeah. Agreed. So let's go on the other side of the peer review process. And do you have any tips and guidance for referees when they are reviewing a paper submission?
First of all, to the referees that might be watching this, thank you. Refereeing is one of our professional responsibilities, and referees, by and large, do a terrific job. I'm always just amazed and awed at this service that we all provide the field for free as referees. This is just awesome, and most of the time, the referee reports I get back are just beautiful. They're, as I was saying before, they're to the point, they're clear, they're constructive, etc. And so when you're refereeing a paper, do that. Just keep doing what you're doing. It's really, again, based on the experience that I've had, it's been just awesome. My respect for people in our field generically, those that participate in the process, has gone up as a result of my time as an editor. That said, some referees do get a little carried away, shall we say, and it's always great to get a 13-page referee report back on a 6-page paper. Often it's a beautiful thing to read and a delight to read, and I appreciate the effort. Sometimes, though, there's arguments over writing style and organization that aren't necessarily the kind of thing that we want a referee to be spending their time worrying about. But again, you're forcing me to give advice to a body that largely does a really terrific job.
Well, I don't want to force you to do anything. Okay, so as long as you spill the pet peeve, I'll spill one of mine on these. And I get that we're all busy people, right? You're writing papers, you may have grant proposals or telescope proposals. I get we're all busy. And so there can be times, and it's perfectly fine that you don't have the time necessary to review a paper. So that's perfectly fine. Just say so when the report comes in. But my pet peeve are those who publish fairly frequently. So they're using the community's time and effort to review their papers, but they absolutely will not referee a paper at all, anytime. That's one of my pet peeves. I just find it very, it's non-reciprocal. It's kind of singular. There's not many of them, I will say, fortunately, but it is one of my little pet peeves. I still bug them. Just
well, you never know. The 14th time you ask,
it might be a first time. Yeah, I still bug them. Excuse me. Okay. So is there any final things you'd like to share about the editorial process with our viewers?
Well, having published in many journals, the AAS journals, the AJ, AppJ, AppJ supplements, as well as what we colloquially call the competition. I can say, and this is totally biased, right? This is a paid advertisement. I think the AAS does an extraordinarily good job in managing their journals. With other journals, I've often had to wait way longer for feedback. I've had to wait a really long time between acceptance and the final publication. So even though some of those other journals are free, you pay in time waiting for the process to go through. And so I'm proud to be part of the AAS journals ecosystem. I think that we do an excellent job. And I know that not just anecdotally, but from my own personal experience. I do want to tell a short story, a very short story of excellent editing by a competitor, though.
Okay.
In the first few years, well, the first year or so of the Kepler mission, I was author of a paper looking at oscillations in hot subdwarf stars, which you know a little bit about, Frank.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the lead author. There were about 20 or so authors. And for fun, I put an extra author in. And that extra author was John Robinson. John Robinson, for those Lost in Space fans, was the father of the space family Robinson in the TV show Lost in Space,
Mm-hmm.
which I grew up watching. And so I figured this is a paper about data from a spacecraft that was looking for planets around other stars. I had to like sneak John Robinson in there just for fun as we were working through several drafts. So I had John Robinson, I had his institute, which was some fancy aeronautical sounding institute in Houston, which was true to the show. And so I left him in the author list as we circulated drafts of this paper. And then finally we were done. And through agreement with the collaboration, we were going to send it to a non-AAS journal,
okay.
Which I won't name the journal, but you can just look it up and figure it out.
Please don't.
in submitting the paper, I forgot to take John Robinson off of the author list.
Ooh.
So I submitted it. We got a referee report back. We answered the referee report. We got another short report back. We made the final changes. It was accepted. At that point, I realized that John Robinson was an author, but it was really too late to take him off because that would be really embarrassing. Or so I thought. So I just left him on there figuring, okay, cool. We'll have John Robinson of Space Family Robinson as an author. We get to the proof stage. I get a note from the editor saying, we've been unable to find an email address for one of your authors, John Robinson. So I responded to the editor. As an editor myself, I was embarrassed to admit. So what I said was, oh, well, John is no longer involved with this project, so we can just remove him from the author list. And the editor responded and said, I'm sorry, we can't do that without his permission.
Right.
So we really do need to contact him. So I thought it was quite amazing that the editor this was one of the science editors, not one of the other editors that this journal uses. Mm-hmm. I was impressed that they found that level of detail, because sometimes we miss joke authors. And so I said, well, I don't know where he is. I got an email back a week later saying, this wouldn't by any chance be John Robinson of the Space Family Robinson of the American television show Lost in Space, would it? And I responded with an email saying something to the effect of, you found John.
Hooray!
So John Robinson is not an author on that paper.
Wow.
So while I'm proud to be working as a AAS editor, I think that other journals, even if we do generally a superior job, other journals have very talented editors working for them as well.
That is fantastic. Awesome. And with that, I think that will do it. So Steve, I want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon and chatting with us about the AAS journals and the editorial process.
Well, thanks, Frank. It was a pleasure.
Cool. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.